Well, guys, you may have heard that rumor that you can't stamp on both sides of a metal blank. It's a lie. Okay, let's just talk about this rumor that you can't stamp on both sides of a blank. It is a statement that I've heard a lot, but it's not true. The key is that you really need to follow some guidelines for your piece to turn out well if you plan to stamp on the front and on the back. And so today I'm going to share 6 tips with you that I have for a well-executed double-sided piece. My first tip is to use blanks that are thick enough. So I recommend using blanks that are 16 gauge or thicker. I'm using a 14 gauge blank for the piece that I'm making in this video. Now, when I'm talking about the gauge of the blanks, the important bit is that the lower the number, the thicker the blank. So a 16 gauge blank is thicker than an 18 gauge, and 14 gauge is thicker than 16, etc. So you'll need to check that thickness when you purchase the blanks for your piece, because a lot of blanks that you can buy are 18 or 20 gauge, like a lot of the ones that are found in craft stores and things, and that's just not going to be thick enough. My next tip is to plan ahead before you start stamping, and I do that by creating what I'm going to call a thumbnail design on paper. It's going to save you a whole lot of waste because you'll get an accurate idea of how your design is going to look, and if the message that you want to stamp out is going to fit on the blank before you ever even start stamping pieces and messing up and finding out after you've done the stamping that this is not going to fit and it's not going to look the way that you want. You can see here that I do it by tracing the blank that I'm considering onto a sheet of paper, and then I write the message that I'm planning to stamp into that shape that I've traced. And it's really helpful for getting an idea of your spacing, and it can serve as a visual guide later when you pick up that hammer and start whacking on the metal. My third tip is that you must have some duct tape or some other kind of barrier between your bench block and your blank. You all know I like putting tape on my bench block anyway, but if you're going to be stamping the front and the back of a piece, you absolutely need that cushioning on your bench block. And that's because the displaced metal is going to need to go somewhere. And by using a taped block, you are directing that displacement to the back of the blank, and at the same time you're avoiding any scratches on the back so that it is still usable when you do that stamping. Tip number 4 is to use additional tape to anchor your blank in place as you're stamping. This is just going to keep your blank from shimmying and sliding around on your bench block as you stamp. And again, that's important because we want to keep that back clean, and also it's going to avoid any misfires or misstrikes. So I just put that blank on the bench block and put some tape on top of it to hold it in place. And of course you can use that tape as a guideline as well. My 5th tip is just don't strike your stamps too hard. You're going to be using a pretty light touch this time, and you'll only strike the stamp hard enough to get a clear impression. If you hit that stamp too hard, you are going to force too much metal to displace out the back side of the blank. And we're wanting to keep that back as clean and undistorted as possible. And if you're struggling to get a good impression, you can try making several softish taps instead of one big forceful whack. So as you watch me stamp here, I'm going to get a little sciencey, and I'm going to try to explain what I'm talking about when I say displaced metal. So when we make a hand stamped piece, we use metal stamps with those letters and numbers in images, and then we strike them onto a blank with a hammer, and the image is transferred from the stamp onto the blank. And that image appears not because we are removing metal, but because we're just displacing it. So we're using a stamp and a hammer to literally shove molecules of metal to the side. You can kind of imagine this principle if you think about it like Play-Doh. So imagine that I have a big glob of Play-Doh that I've put on my table, and if I shove my thumb into that Play-Doh, my thumb is now occupying the space where there used to be some Play-Doh. And the dough that used to be where my thumb is now, it just pushes to the side and kind of slightly changes the shape of that blob of dough. Then when I pull my thumb away, the impression of my thumb is left behind where Play-Doh used to be. And I didn't take away any of that dough, I just moved it to the side when I stuck my thumb there. So if I have a small or like thin glob of Play-Doh, that shift of dough is going to be more noticeable. It'll bump up around my thumb. But if I use a big glob of dough, then that shift of dough isn't as noticeable because there was more material in the dough to absorb the shift. I hope that makes sense. But you can see that principle in action with stamping when you look at a piece that's been stamped hard on a really thin blank. And you can tell because the impression looks weird, but the big giveaway is that the finished piece is all warped and bent out of shape, and it looks kind of like a piece of bubble wrap. So it won't have a nice smooth finish because the only way that the displaced metal could go is up and out, and that warps the metal. So here, where we're using a thicker blank, there's lots of material available within the blank to absorb that shifted metal without warping or damaging the piece. So this all brings me to my last tip, which is also really more of an FYI, and that is that once you've finished the front side of your blank, you're going to see that on the reverse side there are some slight distortions. And if you've done it right, those kind of look like a shadow image of what you stamped on the front. And that's perfect because it means that the displaced metal went right where we want it. So now we just pretend that those shadows aren't even there, and we go ahead and stamp the back side. And once we've finished stamping, those shadow images really are no longer visible. They're pretty camouflaged. All right, so now I'll stop talking for a little bit and let you watch me stamp the back of this blank. Now that I've stamped all of the letters that I want to do on both sides, you can see that those shadow images are just not visible. Like they're there if you look really, really closely, but if you don't know to look for it, you will never notice them. So now I'm just finishing up with a cute little Beducation heart stamp. I love this little guy. I love little hearts for accentuating messages and punctuation and whatever. I like hearts. And now that I'm done stamping the front and the back of this piece, I'm going to finish it up like I do with most of my others. I couldn't find my oil-based paint markers, so I'm using just a regular Sharpie this time, and that's just fine. Both work well. So I'm just filling in those voids that were left by the stamps so that those impressions are visible. I'm going over it twice just to make sure that there's plenty of ink inside of those impressions. Now I am going to use a Pro Polish pad for this blank that I have stamped on. The Pro Polish pad, if you're not familiar with it, it is a little piece of this foamy stuff that has a polishing compound impregnated into the material of the pad. It reminds me of kind of the texture of like a Mr. Clean Magic eraser, but with this you absolutely do not want to get it wet. You need to keep it dry or else it will turn into a gummy mass and it will be rendered useless. So I am going to be careful to polish it in circles and make sure that I get all of the ink out of any area where the ink doesn't belong. And I'm using a Pro Polish pad this time because I would like to have my piece have a high polish finish instead of maybe a brush finish like I would use steel wool to do. Now you can see this backside has a nice glossy finish without really any noticeable warping. If you're looking closely, you might be able to see that transfer from the front, but again, only if you're looking for it. So mission accomplished. And now I'm just buffing off the front to give that polished shine to the front as well as the back. I was struggling to get all of the ink off that I wanted to with the Pro Polish, so I went ahead and just dipped a piece of soft fabric in some rubbing alcohol just to get it damp, and then I can use that to wipe away any remaining ink that I don't want there without ruining that glossy finish that was given by the Pro Polish. And of course, as we finish up, your fingers are going to be filthy. So here it is, all buffed up. So off camera, I punched a hole in the side of this piece with my power punch. And I'm just going to go ahead and attach a jump ring to complete this keychain. And the best way to do that is with 2 pairs of pliers. I squeeze the jump ring with one pair of pliers on one side and the second pair on the other side and just twist it open instead of opening up the circle. I don't know if that makes sense, but like this. And then you can use 2 pliers again after you've put the stamped piece onto the jump ring. You'll just use both pairs of pliers to close that jump ring. And then the piece is finished. All shiny and perfect on the front and the back. Thank you so much for watching. I hope these tips were helpful for you. And I would love for you to leave comments down below about what kind of piece you decided to make by stamping on the front and the back.